talking about protecting all species on Earth, or given that some have already gone, do we say, yes, some can go?
Well, I think quite clearly there are an awful lot of people living in the world today who are in no way connected or benefiting from the vast majority of species. I don't think there are any people living in the world today who are not connected in some way tied to the survival of a healthy planet. Obviously, the health of the planet is largely determined by the availability of natural ecosystems and broad biodiversity. It gets particularly difficult to single out individual issues, and I've often raised the question, are we any worse off today as a species for having no woolly mammoths and rhino in Europe and North America? And the answer would have to be no, we're not any worse off. If we're not, will we be any worse off if there are no leopards and lions, cheetah and elephant and rhino in Africa? Probably not. But if we lose them because of an attitude to the planet, and if in so losing them that we're reflecting a disregard for the context of life and development and the future of our own species, then I think we should be very concerned indeed, and we can't afford to make that mistake. But it's a very awkward position to have to take, but I would think we should be as clear-minded as we can about spending huge amounts of money saving single individual species that clearly are now tightly restricted to small areas, and looking at the broader frame of ecosystems.
If the chimpanzee disappeared, the orangutan disappeared, the gorilla disappeared, would we in any fundamental way, in terms of the survival of the human species, be worse off?
Well, I suspect that our descendants, realizing that on our watch these amazing relatives of ours were just allowed to vanish, they might be a little distressed, or perhaps they would only be present in zoos. If you did a census of all species on Earth at the moment as to which species would be the best one to disappear for the future sustainability of the planet, it would be us. There's no question about that. And, you know, but it seems to me there are three insoluble problems, each of which we must solve for a future that we would be happy to leave for our great-grandchildren. And the first, absolutely, is we've got to level off our population. We have to. And secondly, we have to try somehow and reduce what the elite communities around the world believe that they need, because that's not sustainable. And you know, it's E.O. Wilson who says that if every human being on the planet today acquired the level standard of living of the ordinary, not the extra wealthy, but the ordinary person living, particularly in America, we need 4 new planets. So we need somehow to persuade people that life isn't only about money and stuff. Life is about more. We need people to find a meaning and different values in life so that they make do with less and have what they need, but aren't, you know, always reaching for what they want, which they don't need. And thirdly, the third point is we have to alleviate this crippling poverty that's everywhere around the world and somehow persuade them not to yearn for what we have now, which we have to learn to do less with. So they seem insoluble, but if we can't solve those three, then it's going to be tough to solve the environmental ones as well.
Population, overconsumption, tackling poverty. We'll come back to those. David, just for a moment, sticking with the why do we bother about species, is there a tendency for us to care about, as it were, one says disparagingly, the cuddly ones or the big and beautiful and dramatic ones? And isn't there a case of saying they're actually rather less important than the invisible ones in the earth?
Yes, I'm sure that's right. If you say, well, shall we save the mountain gorilla, or shall we save a small flea that happens to live somewhere in Rwanda? Nobody's in doubt, of course, but that's a false opposition. We ought not to be thinking in those terms. We ought to be thinking of nature as a unity. The fact is that it's easier to focus on a particularly charismatic thing. But actually what we're wanting to save is not a species in that strictly limited sense. You don't save a Javan rhinoceros if you put it in a concrete pit and keep it fed, and that is no longer a Javan rhinoceros. What we have to do is to save ecosystems, the entire complex, fantastic, ungraspable, incomprehensible, marvelous accumulation of interlocking organisms, plants, fungi, animals, insects, mammals, birds, the lot. And that is actually the surest way of saving the Sumatran rhino. That's the point. So that the best route to conservation is to save ecosystems. That's what we've got to do.
Should one be struggling to keep species alive that are not central to the ecosystem that you have to maintain for human life to be possible?
If I may say a paradox, everything is central. There are very few things that you can eliminate without having completely unthought of circumstances and repercussions. Of course, it makes life easier, really, because you can see what the problem is. It isn't a question, I wonder have we really sorted out whether, in fact, the egg production by this particular species is dependent upon a protein which comes from... No, save your time. What you wish to do is to save that coral reef, that tropical rainforest, so that set of deserts.
So when you see, as we do see, that not at a dramatic rate in all species, but in some species, you see the gradual loss of that species, disappearance, threatened species, elimination of species, every single one of those, from your point of view, is a serious diminution of the potential for long-term survival on the planet.
And the ones we notice are the litmus paper, nearly often.
On the face of it, from what we've just heard, it's a pretty grim outlook. If you apply the pure selfish gene interpretation that you do of Darwinianism, humans have the power. They are the most intelligent of all the species on the planet. But the gene, if I understand your usual account of it, means that we as humans think short-term and cannot think in the future long-term, and therefore, paradoxically perhaps, are instrumental in our own downfall unless there is something more to the gene than I've outlined it.
The idea of the selfish gene, which is just another way of putting Darwinism,
Yeah.
it's a kind of genetic way of putting Darwinism, is that all living creatures are machines programmed by their genes to survive and propagate those genes. There has never before in the whole history of life been anything that you could call foresight, caring for the entire world, caring for an ecosystem, caring for the survival of a species. That's just a non-issue in Darwinism. But Darwinism has given rise to the human species, which is unique, which has a brain which is sufficiently large that it's capable of leaving behind the selfish history which gave rise to it. So I think the human species is utterly unique. I think that for the first time ever in 4 billion years of evolution, there are at least some individual organisms on this planet who actually care about the future of the planet. No other species has ever cared about the future of the planet. They only care about the future of their own offspring, etc.
But that involves an analysis or interpretation that the human brain is capable, which is what you're saying, I think, of overriding the sort of ultimate objective of the selfish gene.
And it's quite clear that there are at least some human brains that are capable.
That's what I was...
And there's the rub. But at least those some, maybe it's few, maybe it's more than few, demonstrably are capable of caring for more than the survival of themselves and their offspring and their selfish genes. That gives hope that one might be able to persuade a large number.
I want to pick up on you, Richard, for 1 second, and that is that chimpanzees actually are capable of true altruism, not just saving the lives of their immediate kin or even their sort of second immediate kin, but of totally non-related individuals, even individuals they didn't really know very well before they were rescued. So that it just shows that this evolution, this leapfrog, actually starts just before us.
Yes, no, could I just come back on that? I gave the wrong impression if I suggested that we were the only species capable of non-kin-directed altruism. What I did say is that the human species is the only one that's capable of taking action in the interests of the long-term future. Yeah. And that, I think, probably is uniquely human. Taking action because you've worked out that in a century's time, or in 20 years' time, some disaster may befall if we collectively don't. That, I think, is unique.
The thought that actually you're saying is that we can look long-term, or some of us can look long-term, means that the problems of population, conceivably, the problems of poverty, problems of material overconsumption are problems that can be tackled.
I mean, I think we've got to be very careful we don't get slightly into the ether over this. I'm very concerned that if you're going to get a human response that is, if you like, extragenetic, this bigger view of the value of the planet, you can only do so from a position of security. If you haven't got, at the end of the day, a certainty that you can eat, if you haven't seen clear water since you were born, if you have absolutely no idea of the next time somebody starts to cough whether he or she will die, it's pie in the sky to be talking about extragenetic behavior. It has to be very selfish. And this is why I feel that the attack against poverty is very real, and I think we've got to understand. But I think there's a positive side to this, and I think we've got to recognize that whereas in California or perhaps in Britain, extragenetic behavior is part of a democratic process where people will express this bigger view and push the politicians to do things. And the role of the filmmaker, if you like, and the writer is therefore to create this popular vision of what needs to be done so the leadership can pick up. And in the third world, it's not like that. In the third world, you still have a very small number of people who determine the future of their countries. And it's much easier to persuade 100 people to take positive actions on environmental issues than it is to persuade 100 million. And I think there's a lot more that could be done through the political process. And I don't know of any government official, any organization in public management who will opt for something that makes the environment worse. They will opt to do nothing, or they will opt to take a short-term solution. They don't go out of their way to say, let's destroy the environment.
No, they go out of their way to say, let's destroy the environment if we're going to make a lot of money.
Exactly.
Individually, yes, and that is why we have to find a solution to poverty.
Or if we're going to win the next election. I mean, almost implicit in what you were saying is, if the world was run by a few wise dictators, we'd all be better off than...
I'm quite sure of that.
You are. which takes me actually just by way of example. I mean, you faced the real tensions in Kenya when you were in charge of the parks in saving the elephant for its own sake and for our sakes more broadly. The poachers were in there because there was money to be made, and they, I presume, very many of them employed or were part of the problem of great poverty. You took a very tough line, and you effectively got rid of the poachers, but that is a short-term solution to a long-term problem. How do you, if you take, just by way of sort of concrete example, the game parks, and the people who have ever-expanding need for land, who have ever-expanding aspirations, who have ever-expanding industrial development, cities growing at a dramatic rate, how do you resolve that conflict?
I think one of the things we have totally failed to do, and which I don't know necessarily the answer to, is we have to give nature, we have to give ecosystems, we have to give what we're trying to conserve a value.
A monetary value.
A monetary value. Governments can't look at a balance sheet and see expenditure against an item that has no value. And I think one of the failures in economic thinking is that we can value, if you like, an object of alleged beauty like a Picasso, but we cannot value the Serengeti, except in terms of whether tourists go or don't go. And tourists sometimes won't go, and I think to pick up on what was said earlier, there will be many years ahead when there will be no tourism in Serengeti. Some ghastly incident has happened somewhere in the world and people don't go there. So politicians say, well, if that's the economic value, it has none. But it's not who sees the Picasso that makes its value, it's the Picasso that's valuable. And I think we've got to get a new mindset into people on this issue of value of ecosystems.